On today's episode of How Many Kicks Does It Take to Get to the Center of a Dislocated Ankle Pop? The old Zilla gets a second chance at hitting the trails.
Sorry.
Still sort of running. It just needs some help to be trail-worthy. The last time this thing was running was at some grass drags, and prior to that it had been sitting for quite a while. But ever since then, it's just been collecting dust again. As springtime is approaching, I kind of need to get something on the trail. Don't have the old 250R quite squared away on the paperwork end for, legal trail use, but this thing does. So for some general cruising and, backwoods driving, I think this would be the perfect machine for that. Maybe put a nice storage rack back here, a windshield up top, maybe some nice rear view mirrors. This thing should be great for just putting along and enjoying the scenery. Time to convert it over to trail use. Might even put a trailer hitch on it. Now, even though it was running and driving when it was parked, there's definitely some maintenance items that we're going to have to address. Mainly that water pump seal and drive shaft because, well, they never last long. The brakes need a solid once over. The headlight needs attached better, and, well, I think we only have low beam. The air filter's kind of starting to fall apart. The tires might still be holding air, so we'll try and avoid buying anything new there. The exhaust pipe up there at the flange needs a new seal. And I don't think the shocks have ever been rebuilt since 1989. So you might be wondering, why the heck am I making this thing the ride of choice for trail duty? Well, mainly because it's here. I seem to enjoy accumulating finicky, old, interesting pieces of machinery, but what's the use if you don't actually use them? So it'll do the old Zilla good to get out and stretch its legs a little bit, even if it's just cruising some relatively easy trails and back roads. Heck, maybe we'll take it on some more aggressive trail riding once we get the bugs worked out of it. Would love to throw the paddle tires on there and take it out to some dunes. Oh, I bought those paddle tires when they were $10. But like a lot of projects stuck in purgatory, it's not doing a whole lot right now. So anything will be better than that. And besides, I'm sure people trail rode these things back in the day when they were new. They were just another four-wheeler. And when you've got projects that actually have an end goal, like to actually use them and ride them somewhere, it gives you more motivation and joy out of actually working on it. If you're just repairing something because it needs fixed and it's just going to end up sitting in storage or on a shelf somewhere, what the heck's the point of that? It's like restoring a car and then just parking it in the driveway. So, per usual, we're under a time crunch and had limited weeks to get this thing done. Well, it's barely even weeks at this point, more like days. So the first thing coming out of here is the shock. Now, this whole back end here, maybe it's hard to see, but this thing will actually dip down and spring back just when you rev the engine. So I'm pretty sure that shock is pretty tired. And it pains me to say it, but that's one area that I don't have all the tools or time or motivation yet to actually rebuild myself. I don't know, if I have to start paying to do a few more, we might have to invest in the tools, but for now I gotta send it out and get it redone. Well, dropped the nut from the one shock bolt all the way down inside the swing arm. That's never coming back. I swear these air boxes are gonna be the end of me. This thing's either gonna give birth to that air box or we're gonna have to break out the hammer. If I had the manual, I'm positive this is the right procedure. I mean, antique bumper jacks are a critical part of ATV repair. Alright, so we got the lowrider stance going here. I don't think this is the proper way, but we managed to get that bolt up high enough to hopefully clear the swing arm. Yeah, all the needle bearings went all over the ground. There might be a couple missing, but that's just weight savings. Got this thing moved inside. draining out all the coolant into a clean pot because we're going to recycle it. So the more that I start inspecting the wiring, definitely worked on this thing before. I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm kind of surprised that it actually even had sparks still. That pipe was always really close to hitting the A-arm, if not actually touching it. And you would think that this bracket should bolt onto that right there, but there's just not quite enough room. We might have to make some other type of bracket to move it and try and clearance it away. The last thrash to get this thing running was just for drag racing, so I wasn't too concerned about long-term reliability. But if we're going to put some actual miles on it, got to do the right thing and try and head off as many problems now as you can. Now, I don't recall there actually being anything wrong yet with the motor when it was running last time. However, it's been so long since I had it apart, really don't even remember what all went in and how the exhaust valve went back together. And I don't know if I put those special thrust washers on the wrist pin that are supposed to keep this thing from self-destructing if it comes apart. And the water pump shaft down there, the last time I had it apart, there was actually some play in it. Maybe that's why this thing eats mechanical seals so much. Keeping a collection of mechanical seals gone by. But it'll be easier to have it on the workbench and actually replace it up there, so whole motor's coming out. Yeah, that radiator, that's about as straight as most politicians. And when it got bent, it was also having some interference. Starting to wear through the bottom there. Now, luckily it wasn't leaking, but definitely good to catch it now, not being out on the trail and spewing antifreeze everywhere. Got to try and get the majority of those trail remnants out of there. And also try and straighten up a lot of those bent fins. Can't be good for airflow. No clue when the last time this thing's been taken apart. Yeah, we're gonna need the abrasive wrench for this one. Even finding the sources of some of those mystery rattles. One side was free floating, the other completely disconnected. Well, this is an hour of my life I'm never going to get back. So the brake pads are worn pretty thin in the back, and I thought maybe that was just from riding the rear brake, a lot of miles, who knows. However, trying to pull this caliper off, it is stuck. It was stuck pretty hard on here. So I think something's been dragging. It's either been, there's still pressure remaining in the hose, maybe that e-brake assembly's not blocked off right. Don't know exactly, but we're wasting horsepower dragging the rear brakes. Not sure that's factory. Being this deep in, might as well pull the whole swing arm and go through all of those linkage bearings. I have a feeling they're going to be loose and sloppy and no longer available anywhere. But putting some extra grease in there, you know, that'll make everything alright. So as we keep getting deeper into this thing, I see that flat bar there. I was almost wondering if that was a repair or something that was fixed, but there's blue paint. I'll have to figure out if that's factory or somebody's repair along the way. All of the chain rollers are shot. Not gonna clean any of this. Only gonna remove crud so we can inspect for cracks. Don't want to get preventative maintenance confused with cosmetics. It's definitely interesting though, seeing some of the battle scars and dents and dings, like that front bumper's kind of pushed to the side there. You wonder what all happened to this thing over the years. A lot of people worked on this. Like every fastener is a different size. Probably should check the bearings. I guess if you don't have the right size cotter pin, you just start putting multiples in. Now overall, the quad might be pretty ugly, but at least it wasn't stored at the bottom of the ocean. The axle nuts are actually coming off, and so far, knock on wood, most bolts have actually been coming out without, the threads still attached. So we got the swing arm and the carrier off, and after removing that access panel, there's actually a grease zerk in there. Never knew that. I will give previous owner credit though. They definitely had grease and oil where it should have been. All the little stuff still takes time. Had to double nut these studs to pull the carrier out. Wow, Japan. These might actually be the original bearings. Now there's a little bit of roughness, but they're surprisingly not that bad. So these won't be going in the trash. They'll just go in the spare parts pile for emergency use. Time to start putting some brand new parts in. Since it's now known that there's a grease zerk, I'm going to pull the inside bearing seals, just like the original ones, to be able to purge them from the inside out. New front bearings and seals. Now we found that one of the pivot bearings here has lost half of its cage and needles. Well, I found the needles. They're in a bin. But going to have to do something to kind of rehab that bearing. Well, the cushion linkage bearing, that is pretty grungy down in there. What a disaster. All that rust and mud had solidified, but luckily the bearings were intact until we broke them free with some bearing restorer, and then they started falling out. Now we're just keeping track. We're going to clean all the mud and dirt and rust out, put some fresh grease, reinsert all of these freshly cageless needle bearings in there, because those parts are no longer available, and that'll be about the best it can be. Trying to fix parts like this, you run into situations where there's just no easy alternative or replacement parts. Now, if you didn't have low expectations and standards, you'd basically say these bearings are shot, I need new ones. Well, that goes on to a hunt for some hard to find expensive NOS parts, or you're off trying to find a bushing or something you can press in there, or go into a machine shop and making your own custom fit bearings and bushings. That turns into a whole bunch of time, money, and effort that just kills a project and stops it in its tracks. If you'd have kept running this thing the way it was, in a while, basically the bearings would have been destroyed to the point that there was no bearings left, and you wouldn't even been able to try and save it. So doing a little bit of preventative maintenance like this, hopefully get a good bit more life out of what we got. I don't know. Cage-free chickens might be alright, but I'll take my bearings captive. So while trying to sand and fix up this pivot pin here that's really rusted and pitted, I had a thought. This looks awfully like a wrist pin. So I went up to the trophy shelf and grabbed one of the scrap pistons. Wouldn't you know it, they're the same diameter, just needs a little bit trimmed off the top. Now I'd kind of been keeping an eye out for a set of improved or aftermarket front shocks for this thing. I believe the Banshee is about the only one that's sort of a direct swap over to it, but just haven't come across any cheap deals on those. Allegedly, these shocks are rebuildable, and it is surprising to see there's even a dial on here. On a sort of stock rebuild like this, it's kind of interesting to keep the original equipment as it came from the factory. And it makes it feel like the quad itself still has a lot of its original bits and pieces. Kind of keeps its character there. Gonna wash these shocks up and see if we can't get them apart. Now again, these are the ones that are supposedly not rebuildable. However, if you look, there's definitely a threaded collar that you can take apart on top, and I'm still really kind of impressed by the fact that these are just simple hydraulic shocks with no nitrogen charge, but they actually have an adjustment on them. I'm not sure if it's the compression or the rebound setting, but you got options. Now there's some holes there for a spanner wrench, so you make sure that you use the proper tool for the job. So then that comes out. You get to release the glitter soup. So this inner cylinder has the piston and some valving in it, and the cap of the shock here's got the O-ring for sealing the body, and then there's a regular sort of shaft seal there. Allegedly all these parts are discontinued, no longer available, but I'm sure there's definitely some way you could cross-reference it or make something work if you had to replace them. Luckily these seals seem to be holding. Could remove the eye from the shock if you had to. Now this cap right here, it's got some notches. I tried unscrewing this and it came off, but it turns out that's just a press fit down into the cylinder here. And eventually that comes out. And on the bottom there's a little spring-loaded cap, check valve of sorts, and when you push it, you make a mess. Yeah, you get all that nasty fluid out of there. Kind of got to hold the check valve open and cycle the shock a bit, and eventually you purge all of the nastiness out. There's the piston. It's got some little ports, one in the shaft. I'm just going to clean this off, make sure we get any debris or dirt off of it. Got the tubes cleaned out. Use a nice chunk of brass to not score the shaft when you tap that back in. No clue if this is the right way, but basically you got to hold down the check valve and fill this with oil. First one I did, I had the shaft extended and I filled this completely with oil, and then I couldn't get the shock to collapse. So drained off some oil, and we're leaving the shaft fully inserted at this point, and then we'll top it off. We're using premium SAE 520 shock oil because that's about the viscosity that this looks like, and we don't have any vehicles that use 5W20, so got to use it somewhere. Just keep topping it off and cycling it until there's no air left, and then we'll fill up the tube and just completely submerge everything in oil. And once it's all back together, make sure you can compress it fully without any binding or sticking. I got a little bit too much oil in this thing, so we got to drain some off so we can compress it the whole way. Oh yeah, those are mint. Getting the motor torn down and basically trying to figure out and make sure that the governor for the exhaust valve is actually going to work. I don't think that was correctly set the last time this thing was put together. Now the bottom end actually was rebuilt with a brand new hot rods crank connecting rod, and this will be like the third time that this piston and rings are going right back in the engine. I mean, it's a Wiseco. There's no scuffing. Everything looks great. The compression is awesome in this thing, so no reason to change it. It would be ideal to actually get this head sent out and worked over to correct the squish band. I measured it. Looks like it's 11 millimeters across, so I believe that's still stock. Well, we're just going to have to run high octane fuel right now because no time to actually take it and get it fixed. Time to figure out which wrist pin bearing we're going to use. And we've encountered a unique situation. So the old Wiseco that came out of the engine, well, it had this wrist pin bearing right here. Now there's no markings, so you really can't tell what brand or where it came from. But I believe it was the one that probably came with the hot rods. So not a completely cheap bearing, but maybe not OEM quality. Next contestant is the aluminum thrust washer kit that's supposed to be the upgrade. There's an RM250 bearing. I think 99 was the year you're supposed to get. You need a slightly narrower wrist pin bearing and some aluminum shims to replace the old steel ones there that are prone to breaking, allegedly. Now this may be a brand new bearing, but it just feels chintzy. And you can see that the tolerances holding in the needles into the cage, just not there. And in addition to that, the thrust washers are so big, they just go completely over top of the bearing. I have no idea what that's supposed to serve. So basically just wasted $20-some. That hurts. Time to make a decision. For this comically undersized wrist pin here, you would have thought they could have used something bigger. Piston's about the size of a 350 Chevy piston. We've got 3 categories. Brand spanking new, of import questionable quality, what was in the engine, and it was working, also of sort of questionable quality. And then what we have here, which appears to be an OEM bearing, but it was just sitting in the spare parts pile. You might say, well, obviously go with the new. However, being that this thing is cheap quality, and I actually counted the needles, there's only 12 rollers in this one. The Hot Rods has 13, unlucky number, and the OEM has 14 needle bearings. More bearings, more load distribution. And beyond that, the length of the needle bearings are also longer on the OEM style. I'd say you're going to have a solid 25% more load capacity with all the extra roller bearings, and most likely of a far superior quality. Running the OEM bearing, it is longer, so we can't use those. Well, they're already crap, so we can't use them anyways, but the old steel thrust washers are going to have to go back in for now. We'll just have to keep an eye on things, I guess. Well, even though the old mechanical seal wasn't leaking on this thing, gotta go and do it the right way and put all new stuff in. And I just kind of noticed there must have been a ledge there for the inner seal to ride on. It's broken out and cleared and gone. Yeah, but don't worry, that extra blue RTV, that'll take care of it. Now this part right here, this was the most expensive thing I've had to buy for this thus far. It's the water pump drive thing here, and it's got this weird, probably double row bearing that's pressed onto it, and this was getting kind of loose, allowing the whole water pump impeller to move. When the impeller's rubbing the pump housing, that's a bad sign. And that's no longer available. So I had to buy an NOS one off of eBay. I think it actually came from Japan. Still keep this one for an emergency spare. Maybe try and take it apart and find some different bearings we can swap on and replace that. Some of the parts like this that are buried deep down in the motor, I'll gladly spend a few more bucks to actually get some quality ones rather than some unknown import stuff. Now, don't ask me why, but I always remember that the old Buick socket is the perfect size for driving in that mechanical seal. Gotta use a little bit of caution. You can crack that carbon piece there. There it is, the way it should have been. Are you even rebuilding a motor if you don't strip out at least a couple of the case bolts? So you got the exhaust valve, and there's supposed to be a little stopper there. It's not stopping it on that little tang, so the exhaust valve's just kind of freewheeling it, I guess. Been a little while since that power valve's been out. Although it was still moving, it was definitely getting a bit sticky. The bench might be dirty, but we're keeping the parts clean as they're going back together. Got the exhaust valve back in there. Had to straighten out that linkage there, get that tab to actually stop right, and cleaned it all up, got the carbon out. So I was scouring some old forums and I found a pretty cool chart comparing some dyno runs where they were cranking up the spring tension preload on this power valve, and it looks like about 1 turn counterclockwise preload was about the best for that guy's setup. Now, oil setups are different, but we're going to start off at 1 and, well, see if that's close enough. You can watch through the little inspection port and see if the power valve moves as you bring the RPMs up. So there is tension pulling it back to the open position, which is low RPMs. I always kind of wondered what the heck kind of power valve was this. Usually the ones on the sleds, you know, there's a spade above the top of the exhaust port that opens up and it increases the exhaust port duration. Well, on this thing, it just opens up a cavity that runs down into the crankcase of the motor here. Now, it's separated off from the crankcase. It's just a hollow spot. And basically what that does is when that valve is open, the exhaust, the wave pulse sort of has to go down, travel around before it reflects back, and it basically simulates as if there was a longer pipe than what's on the motor. So it's open at low RPMs, and when it closes, that cavity's gone. Sort of an interesting concept. Some guys disable it and just permanently close off that portion there, so you're always running in high RPM mode. Now, basically, it's not really going to hurt anything. You're just going to lose more bottom end that way. So, I'm going to try and actually keep this functional, because it looks like you actually saved about 20% of your power down below 4,000 RPMs. Head gasket got a coating of the copper spray. Probably not supposed to use it, but there's a couple little nicks and dings, and, well, don't want to take any chances. Carb boot's still sort of flexible, but it looks like somebody cut off the little extensions here that usually go into the reed block. And there is a stuffer plate inside there. I don't think that's factory, but not sure what aftermarket brand that could be. Maybe a Boyas, well, I don't know, you tell me. Alright, pretty much all back together. It rolls over, believe me, there's just compression. Time to start putting the other bits and pieces back on. And we're taking apart the freshly sealed carb boot, because the stuffer is not in there. Got a couple of more days to get this build finished. Almost there. I can't remember the exact story behind this exhaust. Now the pipe is a Paul Turner, and I believe a buddy of mine bought the pipe used, but had to buy the exhaust flange direct from, well, Paul Turner or Duncan Racing or whatever. And it always leaked where the header pipe slid over here. I thought it needed a new gasket. However, it's just a piece of pipe. There's no gasket. It's just a really tight fit to where this slides into the header. Just a bunch of RTV that was smeared around. Well, we've got to try and find something better. Oh great, looks like the pipe's cracking there too. Found a silicone O-ring just the right size to sort of slide over there. And hopefully, when that pipe slides over top of there, it'll rest right up against the O-ring. Yeah, just sandwich it nice in there. Put some RTV on there as well for safe measures, but that's about as best as it's going to get. Well, the pipe repair just got a lot more interesting. As you can see, the original attachment method was that brazed aluminum bronze or brass, and then somebody tried to put a bunch of bubblegum weld on top of it. Don't think that's going to work out too well. And there's another crack too. Not really sure what type of strange brew alloy we created, but regular old steel welding wire, well, it seemed to stick to everything. Spatter's always a good sign of that. So I'm getting ready to start putting all the motor pieces and swing arm back in, and I'm looking at the frame. Kind of been surprised, haven't really found any cracks. And I take a closer look at what appears to be just two different plates on the frame there. Nah, it's about cracked the entire way through. That's just extra suspension flex, I guess. Good enough. Can't really tell if that was something going on with the chain drive that sort of imitated a beaver gnawing its way through the aluminum there, or if somebody was cutting on this trying to remove something. Definitely almost getting to that stage, trying to get that old bearing race out of there. The cage came out pretty easily since it was already halfway disassembled. Now just trying to get that outer race removed. Luckily, since this was already half destroyed, just drilled a little bit of an access hole already through the damaged area, and that was enough to kind of punch that race from the backside and break it apart. Could have probably ran a weld bead down that inside to try and shrink it, like you can do with other bearings. We just didn't have the patience for that. The swing arm bearing kit only came with 2 of the needle bearings. However, there's 4 in the swing arm. Luckily, only one was completely shot, and it's such a pain to get that out we're only replacing that one. We'll keep the extra for a spare, because that'll be real easy to repair on the side of the trail. What a disaster that was, getting that new caged bearing in there. Well, apparently this aluminum is a little bit distorted, and I could not get that new bushing to go in through all the new tightly packed needle bearings. I actually had to remove one of them to try and get enough slack to actually get it through. And it spins, but not well. So we're going to end up having to tear this apart someday, but not today because we're out of time. And speaking of out of time, I found a hairline crack starting, so we just put a hole there to try and stop it. Swing arm is ready to roll. Just as the rear suspension was going in, I realized that the center part of this cushion linkage is supposed to spin, and it wasn't for some reason. Gotta figure out some way to get this by for now. Don't have time to even try to get these obsolete parts. So that's what we got to work with. And that is what is left of the inside of the bearing. Half the cage. Now we can't just throw the needles in there because there's too much space. They'll just start going sideways and, well, not rolling straight. So, we found some of the old needles from the one bearing that we replaced on the other part of the swing arm, and they are smaller, but we're just going to alternate. We'll put a small one in between the larger ones to act as a spacer, and we'll just keep stacking those along until we fill that thing back up. Throw a whole bunch of good grease in it and hope for the best. If you cross your eyes, you can't even tell. Hopefully assembly quickens up at this point. Front shocks are ready to go in. Still got to add some grease down to those needle bearings. It amazes me how many maintenance intensive parts are on this quad. Biggest thing I'm disappointed in is that the U-joints and the tie rod ends aren't greasable. Putting hopefully the last set of non-captive needle bearings into a shock, and we lost this broken seal. It fell down there and defied the laws of physics and somehow made it into the depths of the nether regions below the toolbox. Not like this seal's going to keep a whole lot out, but it's better than nothing. Be sort of a dust shield. Now, full disclaimer on hacking all these bearings back together. I know it's not the right way, and it's not a long-term solution. However, if you got to go riding the weekend, something's got to get done to make it work. And way too often, people just leave well enough alone and wouldn't even bother changing or servicing those bearings down in there, as long as the swing arm still had some semblance of function. Simply ignoring the maintenance points like that would not have gotten any better if we took this thing out and put a few more 100 miles on it and got a bit more water in those bearings. Then you're really struggling to even get the bushings out, or they're completely destroyed, or next thing you know you're egging out holes in the swing arm or the frame mounts and causing even more problems. Next time around that this gets maintenanced, all this good grease in there should at least make disassembly easier. Now the rear shock got a full rebuild on it, so hopefully this thing rides a bit better. Still wasn't able to get a new knob on here, but you can use a screwdriver on that to adjust it. So the rear brakes are here, and you can see from the dampness that the master cylinder is leaking for some reason. It was still working, but there's a little bit of seepage of brake fluid. Not terrible, but while we have it on the bench, might as well look at it. The pads, there is the one real thin there on the bottom. Try to put a little bit of oil into the sliders on the caliper. I don't know if that was hanging up. We'll put some new pads in and then kind of realign it from there once we put it onto the axle. Now, on the old interwebs, it seemed like there's a fair bit of aftermarket master cylinders and stuff you could get. Surprisingly reasonably priced. It's all Chinese junk, but whatever, for like 15 bucks shipped. I was just going to give it a shot. So bought one of those things. Supposed to come in here yesterday. I was expecting to have a nice new shiny master cylinder. And when it came in, it's a rebuild kit. So I guess we're keeping the original and rebuilding it. I'm not against the rebuild kit. It's just the time is getting short on this, and I really didn't need to be spending all that going through here, but thus is life. Well, this caliper is quickly getting more involved. The bolts there do not want to come out. Freed up the bracket a bit, freed up the pads. Don't know if the bleeder cap's even going to come off of there. We're thinking we may just put some fresh fluid in here, cycle it a bunch, make sure that doesn't leak any worse, and we might have to just send it as is. About a 50-50 shot this thing turns into a nightmare and becomes inoperable. Going through the wiring and actually going to solder some of the important connections, like the one going to the ignition coil. Nothing crazy going on with the carb. Just taking it apart, checking for cleanliness, and keeping track of the jetting now. You got to take notes on this stuff. Up to this point, most of the jetting's been done on a drag race basis, so it's either idle, start, or wide open. The needle is one notch leaner than the middle. Gonna throw it back in the center here for safety, for trail riding. Might hurt the fuel economy a bit. We'll see. It'd be easy enough to change on the trail if you have to. Pretty sure this is the stock tail light, but since the old bracket was broken off and gone, we had to make one from an old piece of scrap. Alright, got that in. The old air box is wedged back into place. Hooking up some of the duct hoses. Got to finish doing some plumbing and wiring and bits and pieces, and one step closer to firing it up. Well, probably before firing it up, I'm going to throw some more fluids in it and see if it leaks. Already put a quart of oil into the gear case, just so if I knew there was any leaks, it would be doing it on the bench while it was already out. But knock on wood, it was leak-free thus far. Suppose it's not the worst air box and intake setup. If you loosen the screws, you can always rotate the carb to the side to get to the jets. All the air box is in, and the wiring should be done at this point. So I actually found that rubber isolator mount there for the exhaust pipe. So there's two of them on the pipe now. You never know what you'll find digging through the old milk crate full of spare parts. There's a broken cylinder, a bad crankshaft. Filled up the rad with antifreeze. We'll see if anything leaks out. Time for a test fire. Well, you can tell by the smoke it was running. Camera shut off. The headlight is making a comeback because it is required for the trail riding. But the old original one, for some reason, the glass just is not sitting in the housing right. We've got to be missing a gasket or something, because that whole thing was just flopping around in there. And in addition to the voltage regulator not being hooked up and shaking around so much, it was blowing light bulbs pretty much instantly. So we're going to find the right size fuel line and try and jam it down in along the sides to act as a gasket. Working out just fine. Almost got to put the headlight on, and then saw that the bracket was cracked almost completely through. The tail light that we painstakingly made that bracket for ended up hitting the bottom of the plastics when they sat here on the base. So basically measure once, cut twice. Had to make some spacers here to drop this all down about an inch. Reinstalled the factory key switch. Putting heat tape anywhere there may be an exhaust running nearby. And like the coil there. Any little thing like that you can do to reduce heat load and hopefully increase longevity and reliability, now's the time to do it. It never hurts to actually double check the wiring diagram to try and see what you're working with. Now when I originally put this thing together and I had it for the drags, I had the headlight working, I just wired in directly to the yellow and the black wires that came from the stator. But as it turns out, the voltage regulator was not included in that circuit. So obviously, unlike most sleds that, I'm used to working on, you just run the hot wire from the stator right basically into the voltage regulator, and from there you have a regulated 12 volt DC. But on this thing there was a gray wire coming from the controls up there, and I didn't really know what it was for. So here I look it up in the wiring diagram. The way that they have this thing wired, when the headlights are turned off, it basically shuts off all the power to the headlight and to the tail light, and there's no other charging circuits. It also disconnects the voltage regulator from the stator. So when you're not running any headlights or tail lights, there's no load going to the voltage regulator at all. Not like you're saving a whole lot of horsepower, but you're saving wear and tear on the stator and heat load on the voltage regulator, I guess. So that's how we got it wired in now, factory correct. Found that the shock needed a lot more preload in the rear, so it was cranking on those washers. OEM zip tie. Broke out the old wheel aligner 5000, which is just a couple of pieces of window trim strapped into the wheels. But it's plenty good enough to get the toe set in. Getting into the throttle assembly. Not a whole lot to it, but it's always good to get some dirt out of there and put a little dab of grease just to ensure smooth operation. Time to get the toolkit put together, and needed a 17mm wrench. Didn't have one. However, I have a bunch of these cheap combo 5/8 and 3/4. 3/4 is equal to 19mm, and the 5/8 now identifies as a 17mm. We just cut it out with the grinding wheel. Boom. There's the toolkit. Old plug wrench that's been sitting in the bucket of water for a couple of years. Miscellaneous hose clamps, wrenches, spare extra master link, a couple of good used plugs, screwdriver. Oh man, we're missing the zip ties. Need those. And it's just going to live in this packing bag because, well, the original one's no longer with us. It still won't fit. What the heck, Suzuki? Instead of a 6-pack rack back here, we need something for the whole toolbox. The front seat bracket's been missing for as long as I've had this thing. Got the bracket bent up. Well, now the tank's not going to be bouncing around also. Paint that blue, it could pass for factory. All buttoned up. Plastics are securely fastened. Now if it would just quit raining, could get out there and take this thing for a test drive. Still haven't ran the electrical lights on it yet, so hopefully watch out, make sure there's not a bad voltage regulator and it just pops those immediately. Had to crank up the pretension a bit on that rear spring. The shocks are all pretty much on their softest settings. Can always work your way up from there. Oiled up as many moving parts as we can, and well, we'll see what happens. Made it 15 minutes out testing, and it's back in the shop now. Voltage regulator didn't appear to be regulating, so I'm going to swap that out before we blow out all the light bulbs again. Was able to graft in a snowmobile voltage regulator because they're all pretty much the same. So this tire started going flat. Popped it off the rim to try and see where it was leaking because it was leaking around the seat there. There was so much old slime, Fix-A-Flat, and this just witch's brew of stuff floating around in there. Tried to empty it, It smelled nasty, and basically we tried to clean the bead, reseat it with some sealant, hope it holds. I mean, the back tires aren't doing too bad. No major cracking or anything. The front tires have some, well, we're just not going to talk about that. Got the toolbox full of spare parts and fresh batch of clots and high octane. Ready to rock. Oh yeah, good time. Well, about 100 miles so far. Made it to one of the destinations. Thus far, not too many parts have fallen off, that I'm aware of anyways. So far the brakes are holding out, which is good. Been making adjustments to the carb, but this thing just doesn't like to be ridden super slow at low RPMs. And we got a little bit of gas leaking out the overflow. Overall though, she's hanging in there. I don't know why, but that one tire keeps going flat. You would have thought that it wasn't seated on the bead right or something. These things are easy to start. All right, now give. Just stand on it as soon as you get compression and try and get, you gotta get it some speed to get it a full revolution over. Give her. There you go. He stalled it. So we had to go on a search and rescue mission. Somebody stalled it and couldn't start it. And they got the classic Quadzilla sole. What do you think about driving the Quadzilla?
It's quick. Needs electric start.
Well, it made it back to the trailer under its own power. 141 miles. And it's ended up where it started, back in the shop. Overall, though, the Zilla did pretty good in my opinion. I mean, 141 miles without a breakdown, that's a personal best. Yeah, the fuel shutoff valve might have been giving some issues, and, well, the one tire was leaking, but those don't really count. Looks like that tie rod end was actually rubbing on the pipe. I'm surprised we actually got that much suspension travel out of it. Got to go through those front brakes a little bit better. The front right locked up a lot sooner than the left did, so had a little bit of an interesting handling technique if you had to get on the binders hard. Something that I started running into while trying to get this thing back on the trail was a little bit of sticker shock for any parts that you may need. Apparently, every single thing is worth at least $200 on eBay now. Jeez. And that's going to be one of those things if you're actually going to ride something like this on a regular basis. It's going to need upkeep and maintenance and parts. Really wish I would have picked up a parts machine or at least a motor or something years back before prices went insane. But I guess you could say the same thing about the three-wheelers too. Now, even though it ran pretty good, there's already a list going for a whole host of things that need done. The biggest thing though that kind of affected the riding was the jetting. Now it's got the stock 22.5 pilot jet in that. It's the flat slide Mikuni carburetor. And believe me, we spent a good amount of time messing with the air screw. But this thing does just not want to run smooth just off of idle. It's blubbery, it pops, it sounds like it's four-stroking, it just sounds like crap in general and doesn't run smooth at low throttle positions. You can back the air bleed out more and more to try and lean up the mixture when the slide's all the way closed, but then you end up with a hanging idle and surging and everything else when the throttle is completely closed. So we're going to go to a 20 pilot jet in that, see if we can't clean up that idle because it sounds like crap and you're still putting out a haze of blue smoke as you're just cruising along, so it's got to be rich in that area. If you can believe it, it actually got washed. I mean, there was just too much mud to kind of work on anything else. It was definitely worth getting it out and putting it on the trail. You know, you got a lot more satisfaction and had a lot of fun after you put all the work into it and actually get to ride it. So just like old cars, sleds, and ATVs, keep them in action, keep them out on the road and the trail.